When my son's wife Victoria offered me her grandmother's special herbal tea during what she claimed was a reconciliation visit, I knew something was wrong. The woman who had spent 3 years trying to push me out of my son's life doesn't suddenly become caring. But what Victoria didn't know was that I'd been watching her for months, documenting her lies and manipulations, and this time when she tried to poison the woman she saw as an obstacle to her inheritance, she was about to discover that a retired chemistry professor with 40 years of experience recognizing toxic compounds doesn't go down. Before we dive deeper into this shocking tale, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, and if stories of justice and karma resonate with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something even more unbelievable waiting for you. My name is Margaret Chen, I'm 70 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my manipulative daughter-in-law tried to murder me with a cup of tea laced with oleander extract, not knowing that the frail old woman she thought she could easily eliminate was actually a former university chemistry professor who had spent decades studying exactly the kind of plant toxins she was foolish enough to use against me. Let me paint you a complete picture of how we reached that chilling moment, sitting across from each other at my kitchen table on a crisp October afternoon, 2 delicate porcelain teacups between us, one of them containing enough cardiac glycosides to stop my heart within hours. Because understanding Victoria Pemberton Chen's systematic campaign to destroy me requires knowing not just who she is, but how she became the calculating predator who would eventually try to poison her own husband's mother. Victoria had called me that Tuesday morning, her voice carrying that artificially sweet tone I'd learned to recognize as her most dangerous mood. "Margaret, darling, I've been doing some soul-searching lately, and I realize I may have been, well, perhaps a bit difficult over the years. I'd love to come over this afternoon so we can really talk, heart to heart. Maybe we could have tea together? I actually have some of my late grandmother's special herbal blend. She always said it had a way of bringing families closer together." Quote. The words themselves were pleasant enough, but everything about the call set off alarm bells that 40 years of scientific training had taught me never to ignore. In the 3 years since Victoria had married my son David, she had never once expressed interest in bringing our family closer together. Quite the opposite, in fact. She had systematically and methodically worked to isolate David from me, employing a sophisticated campaign of emotional manipulation that would have impressed a military strategist. Victoria's approach had been subtle at first, so gradual that David barely noticed the changes she was orchestrating in his relationships and priorities. She would make casual comments about how some mothers have trouble letting go when their sons get married, or suggest that my weekly phone calls to David were a bit much for a grown man. She would schedule romantic getaways and couples activities that just happened to conflict with our traditional Sunday family dinners, always with apologetic explanations about last-minute opportunities or scheduling conflicts. Within 6 months of their marriage, our weekly Sunday dinners had become monthly occasions. Within a year, they had dwindled to major holidays only. Victoria always had reasonable explanations. David was working longer hours at his architectural firm, they were trying to establish their own family traditions, or they simply needed more couple time to strengthen their marriage. But I had watched this pattern before, both in my personal life and in the academic world where I'd spent 4 decades observing human behavior. Victoria wasn't accidentally creating distance between David and me. She was engineering it with the precision of a chemist titrating a solution to achieve exactly the desired reaction. The most telling aspect of Victoria's campaign was how she managed to make David feel like the architect of these changes. She never directly told him to stop calling me or visiting. Instead, she would create situations where choosing me meant disappointing her, and choosing her meant gradually abandoning the relationship we'd built over his 32 years of life. When David would mention wanting to visit me, Victoria would remind him about the dinner party she'd planned with her colleagues, or the couples therapy session she'd scheduled to work on their communication. When I would call during their dinner time, Victoria would answer with strained politeness and explain that David was just stepping into the shower or dealing with a work crisis, always offering to have him call back at a time that somehow never materialized. The genius of Victoria's approach was that it made David feel guilty for wanting to maintain our relationship while simultaneously making him feel guilty for neglecting his wife. She created a zero-sum dynamic where any attention he paid to me was framed as attention stolen from their marriage. But Victoria's manipulation extended far beyond simple scheduling conflicts. She began subtly rewriting the narrative of David's childhood and our relationship, planting seeds of doubt about memories and experiences that had shaped his understanding of our family. "Your mother seems very invested in your success," she would say after David shared news about a promotion or achievement. "I mean, it's sweet, but don't you think it's a bit unusual how much she needs to be involved in your accomplishments?" Or, "I noticed your mom still has all those photos of you from high school and college prominently displayed." Most parents understand that their adult children have moved on to new phases of life. These comments were always delivered with a tone of gentle concern rather than criticism, as if Victoria was reluctantly pointing out problems she'd noticed, rather than actively creating doubt about the foundation of our relationship. Over time, David began to see my pride in his achievements as possessiveness, my interest in his life as intrusion, and my desire to spend time with him as an inability to let go and accept his adult independence. Victoria had successfully reframed every positive aspect of our mother-son relationship as evidence of dysfunction on my part. The most insidious part of Victoria's campaign was how she used David's natural desire to be a good husband against both of us. She would create situations where being loyal to me required David to choose against Victoria's expressed needs or wishes, then would respond to those choices with hurt disappointment, rather than anger. "Of course you should have dinner with your mother if that's what you want," she would say when David mentioned our traditional Sunday meals. "I just thought we were going to spend the afternoon looking at houses in that neighborhood we talked about. But your mom is more important, and I understand that." Quote, David, being a fundamentally decent man who loved both his wife and his mother, would try to find compromises that satisfied everyone. But Victoria had structured the dynamic so that compromise was impossible. Every attempt to balance our competing needs resulted in someone feeling disappointed or neglected. Within 2 years, David had begun to see me as the source of tension in his marriage, rather than recognizing Victoria as the architect of that tension. He would make comments about needing to establish boundaries with me, or suggest that I had difficulty accepting his marriage and adult independence. These changes in David's attitude toward me were heartbreaking, but they were also illuminating. I could see exactly how Victoria was manipulating the situation, but David couldn't, or perhaps didn't want to see it. He was so invested in making his marriage work that he was willing to sacrifice our relationship to preserve domestic harmony. But Victoria's manipulation campaign revealed something crucial about her character and motivations. This wasn't just about jealousy or territorial behavior regarding David's attention. Victoria was working systematically to isolate David from anyone who might question her influence over him or provide alternative perspectives on their relationship. She employed similar tactics with David's longtime friends, gradually creating situations where maintaining those friendships became inconvenient or problematic for their marriage. She never forbade anything directly, but she made every relationship outside their marriage require justification and generate conflict. The pattern was so consistent and sophisticated that I began to suspect Victoria had done this before. Her techniques were too polished, too effective, and too psychologically sophisticated for someone acting purely on instinct or emotion. That suspicion led me to begin my own investigation into Victoria's background, research that would eventually reveal information that explained her behavior and provided crucial insight into her ultimate intentions regarding our family. Victoria Pemberton had grown up in Spokane, Washington as the daughter of a middle-class insurance adjuster and a part-time real estate agent. Her family was comfortable but not wealthy, and Victoria had attended Washington State University on partial academic scholarships, graduating with a degree in marketing and communications. After college, she had worked for several years in public relations for various companies in Seattle, building a career that was successful but not particularly lucrative. She lived in a modest apartment in Capitol Hill, drove a used Honda Civic, and seemed to be following a fairly typical path for a young professional in the Pacific Northwest. But everything changed when Victoria met her first husband, Michael Pemberton, a software engineer at Microsoft who was 12 years older than her and earning a substantial six-figure salary. They married after an 8-month courtship, and Victoria's lifestyle immediately transformed. Michael owned a beautiful home in Bellevue, drove luxury cars, and traveled frequently for both business and pleasure. Victoria quit her public relations job and began what she called freelance consulting, though from what I could determine, this mostly involved managing their social calendar and maintaining their home. For 3 years, Victoria lived a life of comfortable affluence, hosting dinner parties for Microsoft executives, taking European vacations, and establishing herself in Seattle's tech community social circles. She seemed to have found exactly the life she wanted: financial security, social status, and freedom from the constraints of traditional employment. But Michael's sudden death and a mountain climbing accident shattered that carefully constructed life. Although Victoria inherited his house and a substantial life insurance payout, the ongoing income that had supported their lifestyle disappeared. She was 31 years old, with no current career, limited work experience, and expensive tastes that her inheritance couldn't support indefinitely. That's when Victoria met David at a charity fundraiser in downtown Seattle. David was 34, an established architect with his own firm, and exactly the kind of man who could restore the lifestyle Victoria had lost when Michael died. But David was also a man with strong family connections and personal relationships that Victoria would need to manage if she wanted to maintain the kind of control over his life that she had enjoyed with Michael. Understanding this history helped me recognize that Victoria's campaign to isolate David from me wasn't personal. It was strategic. She viewed me as a threat to her influence over David and a potential obstacle to her long-term financial security. Victoria needed David to be emotionally and socially dependent on her, just as Michael had been. Strong relationships with family members or longtime friends created alternative sources of advice, support, and perspective that could interfere with her ability to shape David's decisions and priorities. But there was another aspect of Victoria's behavior that concerned me even more than her manipulation of David's relationships. Over the 3 years of their marriage, I had observed subtle signs that Victoria was also working to gain control over David's financial decisions and business affairs. She had convinced David to add her name to his bank accounts and investment portfolios, convenience and estate planning purposes. She had become involved in the day-to-day operations of his architectural firm, ostensibly to help with marketing and client relations, but actually positioning herself to understand and influence his business finances. Most concerning, Victoria had been encouraging David to update his will and life insurance policies to, reflect his new family situation, which meant making her the primary beneficiary of assets that would eventually have been part of my inheritance as his only surviving parent. All of these changes were presented as natural developments in a marriage, reasonable steps that any couple would take to protect their joint interests and plan for the future. But taken together, they represented a systematic effort to ensure that Victoria would have complete financial control if something happened to David. Which brought me back to that phone call on Tuesday morning and Victoria's sudden interest in reconciliation over her grandmother's special tea. Victoria had spent 3 years methodically isolating David from me and positioning herself to inherit everything he owned. She had successfully convinced him that I was possessive, intrusive, and unable to accept his adult independence. She had established legal and financial frameworks that would give her complete control over his assets if he died. The only remaining obstacle to her complete dominance over David's life was the possibility that he might eventually recognize her manipulation and begin to rebuild our relationship. As long as I was alive and capable of providing David with alternative perspectives on his marriage, Victoria's control over him remained vulnerable. But if I were to die, particularly if I died from natural causes that could be attributed to my age and health, Victoria's position would become unassailable. David would have no one left to question her influence or provide competing advice about their relationship. That's what made her phone call so chilling. Victoria wasn't reaching out because she had developed empathy or family loyalty. She was making her final move in a 3-year campaign to eliminate every threat to her control over David's life and assets. And she had chosen to do it with tea, probably believing that a 70-year-old retired professor would never suspect or be able to prove that her death was anything other than natural. What Victoria didn't know was that the, quote, frail old woman she planned to poison had spent 40 years studying exactly the kind of plant-based toxins that could kill someone while mimicking natural cardiac events. She had no idea that I had been documenting her manipulation campaign for months, gathering evidence of her systematic abuse of David's trust and affection. Most importantly, Victoria had no idea that I had been expecting her to make exactly this kind of move, and that when she walked into my kitchen that afternoon with her grandmother's special tea, she would be walking directly into a trap that would expose her true nature and destroy the carefully constructed life she had built through deception and manipulation. I agreed to her visit that morning not because I believed her sudden desire for family reconciliation, but because I knew that Victoria's overconfidence and desperation would eventually lead her to make the kind of mistake that would give me everything I needed to protect David and ensure that justice was served. And something told me that this special tea was going to be exactly the evidence I had been waiting for. To understand how Victoria Pemberton Chen became capable of attempted murder, you need to understand the woman behind the carefully crafted facade, the calculating predator who had perfected the art of emotional manipulation over decades of practice. Because what made her actions so chilling wasn't just their cruelty, but the sophisticated psychological warfare she had waged against my family for 3 years, turning my own son into an unwitting accomplice in his mother's isolation. Victoria Elizabeth Pemberton was 35 years old when she tried to poison me, though she claimed to be 32 on all her social media profiles and dating applications. She was the kind of woman who introduced herself at charity galas by mentioning her, quote, late husband's work at Microsoft, then seamlessly transitioning into conversations about real estate values and investment portfolios. She drove a white BMW X5 that she claimed was a, quote, practical choice for Seattle weather, lived in a stunning craftsman-style home in the Madison Park neighborhood that featured prominently in her Instagram posts, and maintained a wardrobe of designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. To the outside world, Victoria was the perfect widow who had found love again, a successful marketing consultant who split her time between supporting local charities, managing her husband's architectural firm's public relations, and hosting elegant dinner parties that Seattle's professional elite competed to attend. She volunteered at the Children's Hospital Fundraising Committee, posted inspirational quotes about resilience and new beginnings on social media, and had cultivated a reputation as someone who had transformed personal tragedy into a platform for helping others. But I knew the real Victoria, the one who calculated the social and financial value of every relationship, who saw people as either useful assets or dangerous obstacles, and who had learned that appearing vulnerable and grateful was far more effective than displaying the ruthless ambition that actually drove her decisions. Victoria's transformation from middle-class insurance adjuster's daughter to society widow hadn't happened overnight. It had been a carefully orchestrated campaign that began in college and continued through 2 strategic marriages, each one designed to elevate her social status and financial security beyond what her own talents and efforts could achieve. At Washington State University, Victoria had studied the social dynamics of her wealthy classmates with the intensity of an anthropologist. She learned how they dressed, how they spoke, what restaurants they frequented, and most importantly, how they thought about money and relationships. She understood that true wealth wasn't just about having money. It was about having the confidence and social connections that made money feel effortless and inevitable. During her senior year, Victoria had dated Marcus Webb, the son of a prominent Seattle real estate developer, for almost 8 months. Marcus was handsome, charming, and completely oblivious to the fact that Victoria was using their relationship as a masterclass in upper-class behavior and expectations. She studied his family's lifestyle, their social circles, and their casual attitudes toward expensive purchases and exclusive experiences. When Marcus graduated and moved to Los Angeles to work for his father's company, Victoria didn't try to maintain their long-distance relationship. She had gotten what she needed from him: a comprehensive education in how wealthy people lived, thought, and interacted with the world around them. Armed with this knowledge, Victoria moved to Seattle after graduation and began her career in public relations. But unlike her colleagues who saw their jobs as stepping stones to better positions in the same industry, Victoria understood that her real career was positioning herself to marry well. The public relations work was just cover, a respectable profession that put her in contact with successful men while providing enough income to maintain the appearance of independence. Victoria's approach to dating was methodical and strategic. She researched potential partners before accepting dates, learning about their careers, their financial situations, their family backgrounds, and their previous relationships. She maintained detailed notes about their preferences, their insecurities, and their long-term goals, treating each relationship like a business proposal that required careful preparation and execution. Her first serious target was James Morrison, a surgeon at Swedish Medical Center who was recently divorced and eager to prove that he could attract a younger, more sophisticated woman than his ex-wife. Victoria studied James for weeks before engineering their accidental meeting at a medical charity fundraiser, where she positioned herself as a successful marketing professional who was passionate about healthcare philanthropy. For 6 months, Victoria crafted herself into exactly the woman James thought he wanted: intelligent but not threatening, successful but not too independent, sophisticated but appropriately grateful for his guidance and support. She listened to his complaints about his ex-wife's lack of ambition, then demonstrated exactly the kind of drive and accomplishment he claimed to value. But when Victoria discovered that James's divorce settlement had been far more expensive than she'd anticipated, and that his medical practice was struggling with insurance reimbursement issues, she began to lose interest. James wasn't going to provide the financial security and social elevation she was seeking. Victoria's exit strategy was as calculated as her initial approach. She began creating small conflicts and expressing doubts about their compatibility, making James feel like the relationship was ending because of his failings rather than her calculations. When they finally broke up, James was convinced that he had somehow failed to meet the standards of a remarkable woman who deserved better than what he could offer. This pattern, intensive research, strategic positioning, careful cultivation, and calculated exit, became Victoria's standard approach to relationships. She dated a tech startup founder whose company failed to secure second-round funding, a lawyer whose partnership track was longer than she wanted to wait, and a real estate developer whose projects were concentrated in markets she considered too risky. Each relationship provided Victoria with additional education about wealth, status, and the psychology of successful men. She learned what they found attractive, what they feared, what they needed to feel validated and secure. She developed an almost supernatural ability to become exactly what each man thought he wanted, while maintaining the flexibility to disappear when better opportunities emerged. But it wasn't until Victoria met Michael Pemberton at a Microsoft corporate event that she found someone who met all her criteria. Michael was 42 years old, a senior software engineer earning a base salary of $180,000 plus substantial stock options and bonuses. He owned a beautiful home in Bellevue, drove a Tesla Model S, and had investment accounts worth over $500,000. More importantly, Michael was emotionally vulnerable in ways that Victoria could exploit. His previous marriage had ended badly when his ex-wife left him for a colleague, and he had spent 2 years in therapy working through feelings of inadequacy and betrayal. He was desperate to prove that he could attract and keep a woman who was beautiful, accomplished, and genuinely interested in building a life with him. Victoria spent 3 months studying Michael before making her move. She learned about his work projects, his hobbies, his relationship history, and his family dynamics. She discovered that he was estranged from his parents due to conflicts over his career choices, that he had few close friends outside of work, and that he was deeply insecure about his ability to maintain romantic relationships. When Victoria finally approached Michael at a charity wine tasting, she had crafted a persona that addressed every one of his insecurities and desires. She was successful enough to be impressive, but not so successful that she wouldn't need him. She was beautiful enough to validate his attractiveness, but not so stunning that she seemed unattainable. She was independent enough to be interesting, but vulnerable enough to make him feel protective and important. Their courtship was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as romantic connection. Victoria listened to Michael's stories about his failed marriage with perfect sympathy, validating his perspective while subtly reinforcing his fears about being abandoned or betrayed. She shared carefully edited stories about her own past relationships, creating the impression that she had been hurt by men who didn't appreciate her value. Victoria made Michael feel like he was rescuing her from a series of disappointing relationships with men who had failed to recognize her worth. At the same time, she made him feel like she was the first woman who truly understood and appreciated his intelligence, his ambition, and his capacity for love. Within 6 months, Michael was completely dependent on Victoria for emotional validation and social connection. She had gradually isolated him from the few friends and family members who might have questioned their relationship, creating situations where choosing them meant disappointing her. When they married after an 8-month engagement, Victoria had successfully positioned herself as Michael's primary source of happiness, support, and social identity. He trusted her completely, relied on her judgment about financial and personal decisions, and had given her access to all his accounts and assets. For 3 years, Victoria lived exactly the life she had always wanted. She quit her public relations job and focused on managing their home, their social calendar, and their investment portfolio. She entertained Michael's colleagues and clients, planned elaborate vacations, and established herself in Seattle's tech community social circles. But Victoria's perfect life was built on a foundation that she couldn't control: Michael's continued employment and health. She had become completely dependent on his income and benefits, with no backup plan if something happened to disrupt their financial situation. When Michael died in a climbing accident on Mount Rainier, Victoria was devastated, not just emotionally but strategically. The life insurance payout and inheritance were substantial, but not enough to maintain their lifestyle indefinitely. Without Michael's ongoing income, Victoria would eventually need to either dramatically reduce her standard of living or find another source of financial support. That's when David Chen entered her life at exactly the moment when she was most desperate to rebuild her security. David was 34 years old, 6 years younger than Victoria, and exactly the kind of man who could restore everything she had lost when Michael died. He owned a successful architectural firm specializing in sustainable commercial design, lived in a beautiful loft in the Belltown neighborhood, and had built a reputation as one of Seattle's most innovative young architects. But David was also very different from Michael in ways that would require Victoria to adapt her manipulation strategies. While Michael had been socially isolated and emotionally vulnerable, David had strong family connections, longtime friendships, and a clear sense of his own identity and values. Most challenging from Victoria's perspective, David had a close relationship with his mother, me, and frequently sought my advice about important personal and professional decisions. He called me at least twice a week, visited me every Sunday for dinner, and considered me one of his most trusted advisors and emotional supporters. Victoria recognized immediately that this relationship represented the greatest threat to her ability to control David's life and decisions. As long as I remained a significant influence in David's life, Victoria would never achieve the kind of dominance over him that she had enjoyed with Michael. But Victoria was nothing if not adaptable. She had spent years studying the psychology of successful men, and she understood that David's strong family connections were both an obstacle and an opportunity. If she could gradually turn David against me, while appearing to support our relationship, she could eliminate my influence, while positioning herself as the reasonable, supportive wife who had tried her best to bridge family differences. Victoria's campaign against our relationship began almost immediately after she and David started dating. She would make subtle comments about how close David and I were, always framing her observations as admiration rather than criticism. "It's so sweet how much you and your mother care about each other," she would say. Some people might find it unusual for a grown man to talk to his mother every day, but I think it shows what a loving person you are. These comments were designed to plant seeds of self-consciousness in David's mind about our relationship, while making Victoria appear supportive and understanding. She was creating a narrative where our closeness was slightly abnormal but endearing, something that a sophisticated woman like herself could tolerate because she loved David enough to accept his quirks. As their relationship progressed, Victoria began escalating her campaign in subtle but systematic ways. She would schedule romantic dinners or weekend getaways that conflicted with our Sunday family tradition, always with apologetic explanations about last-minute opportunities or special occasions that couldn't be rescheduled. When David would mention wanting to call me or visit, Victoria would remind him about other commitments or suggest that perhaps he was being a bit excessive in his contact with me. "Of course you should call your mother if you want to," she would say. "But didn't you just talk to her yesterday? Maybe she needs some space to develop her own interests instead of always focusing on your life." Victoria was reframing my interest in David's life as unhealthy dependence, while positioning herself as the person who truly understood what was best for everyone involved. She made David feel guilty for maintaining our relationship, while simultaneously making him feel guilty for neglecting his mother's supposed need for independence. The genius of Victoria's approach was that she never directly criticized me or demanded that David choose between us. Instead, she created situations where every interaction with me generated conflict or guilt, making David associate our relationship with stress and relationship problems. Within a year of their marriage, David had begun to see me as a source of tension in his life, rather than recognizing Victoria as the architect of that tension. He would make comments about needing to, quote, establish better boundaries with me, or suggest that I had difficulty accepting his marriage and adult independence. But Victoria's manipulation of David went far beyond simply isolating him from me. She was also working systematically to gain control over his business and financial decisions, using techniques she had perfected during her marriage to Michael. Victoria convinced David to hire her as a marketing consultant for his architectural firm, ostensibly to help him expand his client base and improve his public relations. In reality, this position gave her access to all his business financial records, client relationships, and strategic planning documents. She began attending client meetings and networking events as David's representative, positioning herself as an integral part of his professional success. She convinced him to add her name to his business bank accounts for convenience and to update his business insurance policies to include her as a beneficiary. Victoria also encouraged David to expand his firm and take on larger, more prestigious projects that required substantial upfront investments and longer payment cycles. These projects increased the firm's revenue potential, but also created cash flow pressures that made David more dependent on Victoria's financial management and business advice. At the same time, Victoria was encouraging David to upgrade their lifestyle in ways that increased their monthly expenses and reduced his financial flexibility. She convinced him to buy a larger house in Madison Park, to lease expensive cars, and to join exclusive clubs and organizations that required substantial membership fees. All of these changes were presented as natural developments for a successful architect and his wife, reasonable investments in David's professional image and their family's future. But taken together, they created a financial structure that made David increasingly dependent on Victoria's management and support. Most concerning, Victoria had convinced David to update his will and life insurance policies to make her the primary beneficiary of his assets, including his ownership stake in the architectural firm. She framed this as responsible estate planning for a married couple, but it meant that if anything happened to David, Victoria would inherit everything he had built over his entire career. By the time Victoria called me that Tuesday morning to suggest we reconcile over tea, she had successfully isolated David from me, gained control over his business and financial affairs, and positioned herself to inherit millions of dollars if he died. The only remaining obstacle to her complete control over David's life was the possibility that he might eventually recognize her manipulation and begin to rebuild our relationship. As long as I remained alive and capable of providing David with alternative perspectives on his marriage, Victoria's dominance remained vulnerable. But if I were to die, particularly if I died from what appeared to be natural causes, Victoria's position would become unassailable. David would have no family left to question her influence or provide competing advice about their relationship. Victoria had calculated that a 70-year-old woman living alone would be the perfect victim for a subtle poisoning that could be attributed to natural heart failure or stroke. She believed that her medical knowledge from managing Michael's health issues, combined with her research into plant-based toxins, would allow her to commit the perfect murder. What Victoria didn't understand was that the frail old woman she planned to eliminate had spent 40 years studying exactly the kind of chemistry she was planning to use against me. She had no idea that I had been documenting her manipulation campaign for months, or that I had been expecting her to make exactly this kind of desperate move. Victoria thought she was dealing with a lonely, elderly woman who would be grateful for any attention from her son's wife. She had no idea that she was about to walk into a trap set by someone who understood her psychology better than she understood herself. And when Victoria arrived at my door that afternoon with her grandmother's special tea, she was about to discover that underestimating a retired chemistry professor with 4 decades of experience in toxic compounds was the last mistake she would ever make as a free woman.
The afternoon Victoria came to poison me began like any other October day in Seattle. Gray clouds hanging low over the city. The afternoon Victoria came to poison me began like any other October day in Seattle. Gray clouds hanging low over the city, the smell of rain in the air, and the kind of persistent dampness that seeps into your bones and makes you grateful for a warm cup of tea. By 2:30 p.m., I had completed my morning routine of grading chemistry papers for the tutoring service I occasionally worked with, answered emails from former colleagues about a research publication, and spent an hour tending to the small herb garden on my apartment balcony that had become my retirement hobby. I had been thinking about Victoria's phone call all morning, analyzing every word choice and vocal inflection with the same methodical attention I had once applied to complex chemical equations. In 40 years of teaching undergraduate chemistry, I had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when students were lying about missed assignments, fabricated lab results, or cheating on examinations. The subtle tells were always there if you knew how to look for them. Slight hesitations before key statements, artificial emphasis on irrelevant details, and most tellingly, the tendency to over-explain simple situations. Victoria's phone call had contained all of these warning signs and more. Her sudden interest in soul-searching and family reconciliation was completely inconsistent with 3 years of systematic manipulation and isolation tactics. Her specific mention of her grandmother's special herbal blend felt scripted rather than spontaneous, as if she had rehearsed that particular detail multiple times before making the call. Most concerning was the way Victoria had framed our potential conversation as heart-to-heart, implying an emotional intimacy that had never existed between us. Victoria was many things: calculating, manipulative, ruthlessly ambitious, but she was not someone who engaged in genuine emotional vulnerability or sought authentic human connection. When the doorbell rang at exactly 3 p.m., I was as prepared as 40 years of scientific training and 3 months of careful observation could make me. I had spent the morning reviewing everything I knew about plant-based toxins, particularly those that could cause cardiac events in elderly victims. I had also prepared my apartment with the kind of methodical attention to detail that had made me one of the most respected analytical chemists in the Pacific Northwest. My kitchen table was set with my finest china, delicate porcelain teacups and saucers that had belonged to my mother, along with matching plates for the small pastries I had purchased that morning to create the appearance of a genuine social visit. But hidden throughout the apartment were devices that would document every moment of Victoria's visit. A digital voice recorder concealed beneath a stack of books on the side table, a small video camera positioned behind a decorative plant that provided a clear view of the kitchen table, and my smartphone placed strategically to capture audio from multiple angles. More importantly, I had prepared my own tea service with the precision of a laboratory experiment. I had 2 identical teapots, one containing genuine chamomile tea that I had brewed fresh that morning, and another that would hold whatever concoction Victoria brought with her. I had also prepared 2 sets of teacups, knowing that the success of my plan would depend on my ability to control exactly which cup each of us drank from. When I opened the door, Victoria stood on my threshold looking every inch the concerned daughter-in-law, making a difficult but necessary gesture toward family reconciliation. She was dressed in a soft gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, carrying a designer handbag and a small gift bag that presumably contained her grandmother's special tea blend. "Margaret, thank you so much for agreeing to see me," Victoria said, leaning forward to give me the kind of air kiss greeting that wealthy Seattle women use to demonstrate social sophistication. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I realize how much I've missed having a real relationship with you." The performance was flawless. exactly the right combination of gratitude, vulnerability, and determination that would convince most people that Victoria was making a genuine effort to repair our relationship. Her voice carried just the right note of nervous sincerity, and her body language suggested someone who was genuinely hopeful but appropriately cautious about the outcome of our meeting. But I had spent months studying Victoria's manipulation techniques, and I could see the calculation behind every gesture and expression. The way she held the gift bag containing the tea, slightly forward and visible, ensuring I would notice it immediately. The way she glanced around my apartment as if seeing it for the first time, cataloging details that might be useful for future manipulation. Most tellingly, the way her eyes briefly assessed my physical condition and energy level, as if calculating how much resistance I might be able to offer if her plan required physical force. "Please, come in," I said, stepping aside to let her enter. "I have to admit, I was surprised by your call this morning. It's not like you to reach out for family conversations." Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment, a micro expression that revealed her annoyance at my directness before she recovered her composure. "I know, and I feel terrible about that. I think I've been so focused on helping David establish our marriage that I may have lost sight of the importance of maintaining family relationships." This response was particularly revealing because it positioned Victoria as the victim of her own good intentions, rather than acknowledging any deliberate effort to isolate David from me. She was already beginning to construct the narrative that would explain away 3 years of systematic manipulation as unfortunate side effects of her devotion to David's happiness. "Well, let's sit down and have that tea you mentioned," I said, leading her toward the kitchen table where I had prepared our afternoon setting. "I'm curious about this family blend you wanted to share." Victoria brightened immediately, reaching into her gift bag to withdraw a small tin container with an ornate floral design. "This is so special to me," she said, opening the tin to reveal what appeared to be a mixture of dried herbs and flowers. "My grandmother always said this blend had healing properties, that it could bring peace to troubled relationships and help people see past their differences." She held the tin out for me to smell, and I leaned forward to examine the contents with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades identifying chemical compounds. The mixture appeared to contain chamomile, lavender, and what looked like dried rose petals, all harmless herbs that were commonly used in relaxation teas. But there were also several components I didn't immediately recognize, including some small leaves with a distinctive waxy appearance that set off immediate alarm bells in my memory. "It smells lovely," I said, though in reality the mixture had an underlying bitter scent that was expertly masked by the aromatic herbs. "Why don't you prepare it while I get some pastries from the kitchen? I want to make sure we do this properly." This suggestion served multiple purposes. It would allow me to observe Victoria's tea preparation process while appearing to be a gracious hostess. It would also give me the opportunity to implement the cup switching strategy I had been planning since her phone call that morning. Victoria seemed pleased to take charge of the tea preparation, which confirmed my suspicion that she wanted to maintain complete control over what I would be drinking. She moved with surprising confidence in my kitchen, locating my teapot and filling it with water as if she had done this many times before. "I always use boiling water for herbal blends," Victoria explained as she waited for the kettle to heat. "My grandmother said the higher temperature helps release all the beneficial compounds in the herbs." This statement was both technically accurate and ominous. Boiling water would indeed extract more compounds from plant materials, including toxic alkaloids that might be present in whatever Victoria had added to her supposedly healing blend. While Victoria focused on the tea preparation, I arranged pastries on a serving plate and used the opportunity to study her body language and facial expressions. She was more relaxed than I had seen her in months, suggesting that she felt confident about the success of her plan. There was also an almost excited energy in her movements, as if she was anticipating something pleasant rather than dreading a difficult conversation. When the water reached a boil, Victoria carefully measured her herb mixture into my teapot, using what appeared to be a pre-portioned amount that she had brought in a small paper envelope. She poured the boiling water over the herbs with practiced precision, then set a timer on her phone for exactly 5 minutes. Steeping time is critical, she explained. Too short and you don't get the full benefits. Too long and it becomes bitter. The clinical precision of her approach was chilling. Victoria wasn't experimenting with an unfamiliar tea blend. She had clearly prepared this exact mixture before and knew exactly how long it needed to steep to achieve the desired potency. During the 5-minute steeping period, Victoria maintained a steady stream of conversation about her desire to rebuild our relationship and her regret about the misunderstandings that had created distance between us. But I noticed that she frequently glanced at her phone timer and seemed increasingly excited as the steeping time approached completion. When the timer chimed, Victoria immediately removed the tea strainer and poured the dark amber liquid into our waiting teacups. The color was deeper than normal chamomile tea, and I could detect that underlying bitter scent even more strongly now that the mixture had been fully extracted. "Here we are," Victoria said, carrying both cups to the table with a bright smile. "Grandmother's special blend, prepared just the way she taught me." This was the critical moment I had been preparing for since Victoria's phone call. As she set the cups on the table, I carefully noted which one she placed in front of me and which one she positioned at her own place setting. Then, while Victoria was returning to the kitchen to get the teapot for refills, I quickly and smoothly switched our cups. The movement was so subtle and natural that it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically watching for it. I simply reached across the table as if adjusting the position of the pastry plate, and in the process, rotated our cups so that the one Victoria had prepared for me was now sitting at her place. When Victoria returned to the table, she showed no awareness that anything had changed. She was too focused on the performance of reconciliation to pay close attention to details that didn't directly support her plan. "Before we drink," Victoria said, settling into her chair with the expression of someone about to deliver an important speech, "I want to say how sorry I am for the way things have developed between us. I know David's marriage has changed the dynamics of your relationship with him, and I take responsibility for not doing more to help you feel included in our new family structure." This apology was masterfully crafted to sound sincere while actually reinforcing Victoria's narrative that our relationship problems were caused by my inability to adapt to David's marriage, rather than her deliberate manipulation campaign. She was positioning herself as the mature, reasonable person who was graciously taking responsibility for problems that were really my fault. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, picking up my teacup, which now contained the mixture Victoria had prepared for herself, and holding it casually while we talked. "I have to admit, there have been times when I felt like you saw me as more of an obstacle than a family member." Victoria's eyes flickered with something that might have been annoyance or calculation before she smiled and reached for her own cup, the one that now contained the poisoned blend she had intended for me. "I can understand why you might have felt that way," she said, "and that's exactly why I wanted us to have this conversation. I think we need to clear the air about our expectations and find a way to move forward that works for everyone." Victoria raised her cup in a gesture that was clearly meant to signal the beginning of our reconciliation toast. "To new beginnings and better understanding between us," she said. I raised my own cup in response, watching Victoria's face carefully as we both brought the tea to our lips. This was the moment when Victoria expected to administer what she believed would be a fatal dose of plant toxins to a trusting elderly woman who had no idea she was being murdered. Instead, Victoria was about to discover what it felt like to be the victim of her own poison. We both took our first sip simultaneously, and I had to suppress a smile as Victoria maintained her expression of hopeful sincerity while unknowingly consuming the toxic brew she had prepared for me. The taste was as bitter as I had expected, despite the masking herbs, and I noticed Victoria's slight grimace as she swallowed. "This is quite potent," I commented, setting my cup down after taking only a small sip. "Your grandmother certainly knew her herbs." Victoria nodded enthusiastically, apparently interpreting my comment as appreciation rather than suspicion. She always said that the most effective remedies often taste the strongest, she replied, taking another substantial sip from her cup. Over the next 20 minutes, Victoria continued her performance of reconciliation, while unknowingly poisoning herself with increasing doses of whatever toxic compound she had intended for me. She spoke eloquently about her desire to support David's relationship with me, her regret about past misunderstandings, and her hope that we could build a genuine friendship moving forward. But as the conversation progressed, I began to notice subtle changes in Victoria's appearance and demeanor that suggested the toxins were beginning to affect her system. Her skin developed a slight flush that could have been attributed to the warmth of the tea or the emotional intensity of our conversation. Her speech patterns became slightly more rapid and less controlled, as if she was having difficulty regulating her pace and tone. Most tellingly, Victoria began to show signs of increasing agitation despite the supposedly calming nature of our reconciliation. She fidgeted with her jewelry, checked her phone repeatedly, and seemed to have difficulty maintaining the focused attention that her manipulation techniques required. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked with apparently innocent concern. "You seem a bit flushed." Victoria's hand moved instinctively to her cheek, and I could see her trying to assess whether she was experiencing something abnormal. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Maybe just a little warm. Your apartment is quite cozy." But Victoria wasn't fine, and as she continued to drink the tea she had prepared for me, her condition continued to deteriorate in ways that became increasingly difficult to hide. Her hands developed a slight tremor that made it challenging for her to hold her teacup steadily. Her breathing became more shallow and rapid, and she began to perspire despite the comfortable temperature in my apartment. "Victoria," I said, allowing a note of genuine concern to enter my voice, "you really don't look well. Maybe you should stop drinking the tea for a moment." This suggestion created an interesting dilemma for Victoria. If she stopped drinking the tea, she would be abandoning her plan to poison me, since she believed I was consuming the same mixture. But if she continued drinking, she would be increasingly affected by whatever toxic compounds she had added to the blend. Victoria chose to continue drinking, apparently believing that she could tolerate the effects long enough to ensure that I consumed a lethal dose. "I'm really fine," she insisted, though her voice was becoming noticeably strained. "I think I'm just emotional about finally having this conversation with you." Over the next 10 minutes, Victoria's condition progressed from uncomfortable to obviously distressed. Her face became increasingly flushed, her hands shook more visibly, and she began to show signs of nausea and disorientation. She would start sentences and then seem to forget what she was saying, and her carefully maintained facade of reconciliation began to crack under the physical stress she was experiencing. "Margaret," Victoria said, setting down her teacup with obvious difficulty, "I think I might need to use your bathroom. I'm feeling a bit dizzy." This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when Victoria would realize that something was seriously wrong and would begin to suspect that her carefully planned murder attempt had somehow gone awry. "Of course," I said, standing to help her to the bathroom. "Are you sure you're all right? You look quite pale now." Victoria accepted my assistance with obvious reluctance, clearly struggling to maintain her composure while dealing with increasingly severe physical symptoms. As we walked toward the bathroom, I could feel her trembling and noticed that her breathing had become labored and irregular. "I don't understand," Victoria murmured, more to herself than to me. "This has never happened before." That phrase, "this has never happened before," was the first crack in Victoria's carefully constructed story about her grandmother's healing tea blend. It suggested that Victoria had used this particular mixture previously and had expected specific results that weren't occurring as planned. When Victoria emerged from the bathroom several minutes later, her condition had deteriorated significantly. Her face was now pale with an underlying grayish tint. Her movements were unsteady, and she was clearly struggling to think clearly or speak coherently. "I think," Victoria said, gripping the back of her chair for support, I think there might be something wrong with the tea. This was the moment I had been preparing for since Victoria's phone call that morning. The moment when she would realize that her murder attempt had failed and that she was now the victim of her own poison. Something wrong with the tea? I repeated with perfectly calibrated surprise and concern. But Victoria, you prepared it yourself with your grandmother's special blend. Surely you would know if there was anything dangerous in it. Victoria stared at me with growing comprehension and horror as she began to understand the implications of my words. She was starting to realize that I knew exactly what had happened and that her condition was not the result of an accident or coincidence. You. Victoria began, then stopped as another wave of nausea and disorientation hit her. You switched the cups. Did I? I asked with the same tone of innocent concern. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. We both drank from the same tea that you prepared. Are you saying there was something harmful in your grandmother's healing blend? Victoria's eyes widened as she finally understood the full scope of what had happened. She had come to my apartment planning to commit murder with plant-based toxins, only to discover that she had been outmaneuvered by someone who understood her plan better than she understood it herself. Help me, Victoria whispered, her voice weak and desperate. Please, I need to get to a hospital. Of course, I said, reaching for my phone with appropriate urgency. But Victoria, I think the emergency responders are going to want to know exactly what you put in that tea blend. If you've been poisoned, they'll need to know what they're treating. Victoria's face went white as she realized that seeking medical help would require her to explain exactly what toxic compounds she had used, thereby confessing to attempted murder in front of medical professionals who would be required to report her crimes to law enforcement. I can't, Victoria said, sliding down into her chair as her strength continued to fail. I can't tell them. Can't tell them what? I pressed, maintaining my expression of concerned confusion. Victoria, if your grandmother's tea blend contains something harmful, surely that's information the doctors need to save your life. But Victoria couldn't explain what was in the tea without confessing to attempted murder, and she couldn't refuse medical treatment without risking death from her own poison. She had created a perfect trap for herself, and there was no way out that didn't involve admitting to crimes that would destroy her life and send her to prison. As I dialed 911 to request emergency medical assistance, I watched Victoria struggle with the realization that her carefully planned murder attempt had not only failed, but had also provided me with everything I needed to prove her true intentions and ensure that she faced justice for her crimes. The woman who had spent 3 years systematically destroying my relationship with my son, who had planned to poison me with plant toxins while pretending to seek reconciliation, was about to discover that underestimating a retired chemistry professor had been the biggest mistake.
While Victoria sat in my kitchen chair, trembling from the effects of her own poison and struggling to comprehend how her perfect murder plan had been turned against her, she had no idea that the frail elderly woman she had tried to eliminate possessed knowledge and resources that made her far more dangerous than any adversary Victoria had ever encountered. Because what Victoria didn't understand, what she couldn't have imagined in her most paranoid moments, was that the modest retired professor sipping tea across from her was actually one of the most respected analytical chemists in the Pacific Northwest, with 40 years of experience in exactly the kind of toxicology that Victoria had foolishly chosen to use as her weapon. My name is Dr. Margaret Chen, and while Victoria knew I was a retired chemistry professor, she had never bothered to research the specifics of my career or the reputation I had built over 4 decades in academic and forensic chemistry. To Victoria, I was simply David's mother, an obstacle to be removed, an elderly woman living on a professor's pension who posed no real threat to someone with Victoria's intelligence and determination. But Victoria's casual dismissal of my professional background was about to prove the most costly mistake of her criminal career. Because the woman she had chosen to murder with plant-based toxins was actually Dr. Margaret Chen, Professor Emerita of Analytical Chemistry at the University of Washington, former director of the Pacific Northwest Poison Control Research Laboratory, and internationally recognized expert in forensic toxicology, who had spent the last 15 years of her career helping law enforcement agencies solve poisoning cases across the western United States. My specialty, the area of research that had defined my academic career and earned me recognition from colleagues around the world, was the identification and analysis of plant-based toxins used in criminal poisonings. I had published over 60 peer-reviewed articles on the subject, testified as an expert witness in dozens of criminal trials, and trained hundreds of law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and forensic scientists in the detection and analysis of botanical poisons. The irony of Victoria's choice of murder weapon was so perfect that it would have been comedic if it weren't so deadly serious. She had chosen to poison someone who had literally written the textbook on plant-based toxins used in homicide cases. The mixture she had prepared for me, oleander extract combined with digitalis and several other cardiac glycosides, was a combination I had analyzed in at least a dozen criminal investigations over the past 2 decades. But Victoria's ignorance about my professional background was just the beginning of the miscalculations that had doomed her murder attempt from the moment she conceived it. Because while she had been spending 3 years manipulating David and planning my elimination, I had been conducting my own investigation into her past, her methods, and her ultimate intentions. My investigation had begun innocently enough, shortly after David announced his engagement to Victoria. As a mother who loved her son, I had wanted to learn more about the woman he planned to marry. But as someone who had spent 40 years analyzing evidence and identifying patterns, I had quickly noticed inconsistencies in Victoria's story that demanded further investigation. Victoria claimed to be a successful marketing consultant who had met David at a charity fundraiser. But when I discreetly researched her professional background, I discovered that her consulting business had no web presence, no client testimonials, and no evidence of actual work beyond a basic business registration with the state of Washington. Victoria claimed to be a widow grieving the loss of her first husband in a tragic climbing accident. But when I accessed public records about Michael Pemberton's death, I found discrepancies in Victoria's timeline and details that suggested she had been far more prepared for his death than a loving wife should have been. Most troubling, Victoria claimed to come from a close-knit family with strong values and traditional morals. But my research revealed that she had been estranged from her parents for over a decade, had no contact with her siblings, and had left a trail of broken relationships and financial disputes throughout her adult life. These discoveries had prompted me to dig deeper into Victoria's background, using resources and techniques I had developed during my years of forensic consulting work. What I found was a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back over 15 years and included at least 3 previous relationships where Victoria had systematically isolated men from their families and support systems before gaining control over their finances and assets. The most chilling discovery was information about Victoria's relationship with her previous husband, Michael Pemberton. According to medical records I was able to access through professional contacts, Michael had experienced a series of unexplained health issues during the final year of their marriage, symptoms that were consistent with chronic low-level poisoning by plant-based toxins. Michael's death certificate listed the cause of death as, quote, cardiac arrest due to exertion at high altitude, but the medical examiner's notes mentioned unusual cardiac irregularities that had contributed to his inability to survive what should have been a survivable climbing accident. No toxicology testing had been performed because the death appeared to be clearly accidental, but the symptoms Michael had experienced before his death were remarkably similar to those caused by chronic oleander exposure. I had also discovered that Victoria had researched plant-based poisons extensively in the months before Michael's death, using the computer at her local library to access articles about digitalis poisoning, oleander toxicity, and methods of extracting cardiac glycosides from common garden plants. The librarian who assisted with these research sessions remembered Victoria specifically because she had asked detailed questions about the medicinal and toxic properties of various plants. Armed with this information, I had realized that Victoria represented a far greater threat to David than simple emotional manipulation or financial exploitation. She was a serial predator who used plant-based poisons to eliminate obstacles to her plans, and she had almost certainly murdered her previous husband using techniques she was now planning to use against me, This discovery had prompted me to begin preparing for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. Victoria would eventually realize that I posed a threat to her control over David, and when that moment came, she would attempt to eliminate me using the same methods she had used against Michael. But unlike Michael, I was not an unsuspecting victim who would consume poison without recognizing what was happening. I was a forensic toxicologist who could identify plant-based poisons by their smell, their appearance, and their effects. More importantly, I was someone who had been expecting Victoria's attack and had prepared countermeasures that would turn her own weapons against her. My preparation had begun 6 months earlier, when I noticed that Victoria's manipulation of David was reaching a critical phase. She had successfully isolated him from most of his friends and family members, had gained significant control over his business and financial affairs, and was beginning to make comments about my declining health and increasing confusion that suggested she was laying the groundwork for claims about my mental incompetence. I had recognized these as classic patterns that preceded more direct action against elderly family members who posed obstacles to inheritance or control schemes. Victoria was preparing to make her final move, and I needed to be ready to document and counter whatever attack she chose to make. My first step had been to establish comprehensive documentation of my own mental and physical health, working with independent medical professionals to create records that would refute any claims Victoria might make about my competence or capacity. I underwent neuropsychological testing, comprehensive physical examinations, and cognitive assessments that established my complete mental acuity and physical health. These medical records were crucial because they would prevent Victoria from successfully claiming that I was confused, paranoid, or mentally incompetent if I accused her of attempted murder. Any defense attorney who tried to suggest that I had imagined or fabricated evidence of poisoning would be confronted with extensive medical documentation proving my complete mental clarity and reliability. I had also begun documenting Victoria's behavior patterns and manipulation techniques, creating a detailed record of her systematic campaign to isolate David from his family and support systems. This documentation included photographs of family gatherings that Victoria had disrupted, recordings of phone conversations where she made disparaging comments about me, and copies of emails and text messages that revealed her strategies for controlling David's schedule and relationships. Most importantly, I had begun working with Dr. James Patterson, a colleague from my forensic toxicology days, who now ran a private analytical laboratory specializing in poison detection and analysis. Dr. Patterson had helped me establish monitoring systems that would allow me to quickly identify and analyze any toxic substances that Victoria might attempt to use against me. When Victoria called that Tuesday morning to suggest our reconciliation tea, I had immediately contacted Dr. Patterson to put our detection systems on standby. I knew that Victoria's sudden interest in family harmony meant she was preparing to make her final move, and I wanted to be ready to capture and analyze whatever poison she brought to our meeting. The analytical equipment Dr. Patterson had provided was concealed throughout my apartment in ways that would be invisible to a casual observer, but would allow me to collect samples and evidence of any toxic substances Victoria might introduce. I had portable mass spectrometry equipment hidden in my kitchen cabinets, digital pH meters disguised as decorative objects, and sampling containers that would allow me to preserve evidence for later analysis. But my most important preparation was psychological rather than technical. I had spent months studying Victoria's manipulation techniques, learning to recognize her tells and patterns, and preparing myself to respond to her strategies without revealing my own knowledge and intentions. Victoria was skilled at reading people and adapting her approach based on their reactions and responses. If I had shown any sign of suspicion or awareness during her visit, she might have abandoned her plan and chosen a different method of attack. Instead, I needed to appear exactly as she expected, a naive elderly woman who was grateful for attention from her son's wife and completely unprepared for the betrayal that was coming. This performance had required every bit of acting skill I could muster, because watching Victoria prepare poison for me while maintaining a facade of family reconciliation was one of the most chilling experiences of my life. But I had forced myself to stay in character, responding to her manipulation attempts with the kind of emotional vulnerability and gratitude that would encourage her to proceed with her plan. The cup-switching strategy I had employed was something I had been planning for weeks, practicing the movements until I could execute them smoothly and naturally without drawing attention to what I was doing. I had studied Victoria's behavioral patterns during previous visits, noting that she tended to focus intensely on her own performance rather than paying careful attention to environmental details that didn't directly support her objectives. When Victoria had returned to the kitchen to get the teapot, her attention had been completely focused on maintaining her role as the caring daughter-in-law seeking reconciliation. She had been so invested in her performance that she failed to notice the subtle rearrangement of our tea service that would ultimately save my life and destroy hers. But the cup switch was only the beginning of my counter-strategy. While Victoria was unknowingly poisoning herself with her own toxic tea blend, I was collecting evidence that would prove her attempted murder and ensure that she faced the full consequences of her crimes. The digital recording equipment I had concealed throughout my apartment was capturing every word of our conversation, including Victoria's detailed explanations of her grandmother's healing tea and her specific instructions about preparation methods that revealed her knowledge of toxic plant extraction techniques. The video cameras I had positioned around my kitchen were documenting Victoria's tea preparation process, showing exactly how she measured and mixed the ingredients she had brought with her. This footage would provide irrefutable evidence that Victoria had deliberately prepared a toxic mixture and had intended for me to consume it. Most importantly, I was collecting samples of Victoria's tea blend for analysis by Dr. Patterson's laboratory. While Victoria focused on her performance of reconciliation, I had used small syringes concealed beneath the table to collect portions of the tea mixture for chemical analysis. These samples would provide definitive proof of exactly what toxins Victoria had used and in what concentrations. The analytical results I would receive from Dr. Patterson's laboratory would be devastating to any defense Victoria might attempt to mount. The tea mixture she had prepared contained oleander extract, digitalis, and several other cardiac glycosides in concentrations that would have been lethal to someone of my age and body weight. There was no possible explanation for these compounds being present in a legitimate herbal tea blend. Their presence could only be explained by deliberate criminal intent. But perhaps the most damning evidence I was collecting was Victoria's own behavior and statements during our meeting. As the poison she had intended for me began to affect her own system, Victoria's careful facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of the calculating predator beneath her performance of family reconciliation. When Victoria realized that something was wrong with the tea, her first concern had not been for my safety or welfare, it had been for the success of her plan. When she suspected that the cups had been switched, her reaction had been anger and panic rather than confusion or concern. These responses revealed someone who knew exactly what toxic substances were in the tea and who had expected them to affect me rather than her. Most tellingly, when I suggested that Victoria seek medical help for her deteriorating condition, she had refused to explain what was in the tea blend because doing so would require her to confess to attempted murder. This response proved that Victoria knew the tea contained lethal toxins and that she had prepared it with criminal intent. All of this evidence, the recordings, the video footage, the chemical analysis, and Victoria's own statements and behavior would combine to create an overwhelming case for attempted murder that no defense attorney could successfully challenge. But Victoria still didn't understand the full scope of what she was facing. She thought she was dealing with a lucky elderly woman who had somehow stumbled onto her plan and managed to turn it against her. She had no idea that she had attempted to murder one of the most qualified forensic toxicologists in the country, someone who had spent decades helping law enforcement agencies solve exactly the kind of crime Victoria had just attempted. The expertise that Victoria had dismissed as irrelevant, my background in analytical chemistry and forensic toxicology, was actually the perfect preparation for recognizing, documenting, and prosecuting her murder attempt. Every technique she had used, every compound she had chosen, every method she had employed, was something I had encountered multiple times in my professional career. More importantly, Victoria had no idea that I had been investigating her background for months and had uncovered evidence of her previous crimes, including the probable murder of her first husband. The attempted poisoning she had just committed wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of predatory behavior that would make her prosecution far more serious, and her potential sentence far more severe. When the paramedics arrived to treat Victoria's poisoning symptoms, They would find a woman who had been caught in the act of attempted murder by someone with the knowledge, resources, and evidence to ensure that she spent the rest of her life in prison. Victoria had chosen to target the one person in Seattle who was perfectly equipped to recognize her methods, counter her strategies, and ensure that justice was served for her crimes. And she was about to discover that underestimating a forensic toxicologist had been the last mistake she would ever make as a free woman. While Victoria sat in my kitchen chair, trembling from the effects of her own poison and struggling to comprehend how her perfect murder plan had been turned against her, she had no idea that the frail elderly woman she had tried to eliminate possessed knowledge and resources that made her far more dangerous than any adversary Victoria had ever encountered. Because what Victoria didn't understand, what she couldn't have imagined in her most paranoid moments, was that the modest retired professor sipping tea across from her was actually one of the most respected analytical chemists in the Pacific Northwest, with 40 years of experience in exactly the kind of toxicology that Victoria had foolishly chosen to use as her weapon. My name is Dr. Margaret Chen, and while Victoria knew I was a retired chemistry professor, she had never bothered to research the specifics of my career or the reputation I had built over 4 decades in academic and forensic chemistry. To Victoria, I was simply David's mother, an obstacle to be removed, an elderly woman living on a professor's pension who posed no real threat to someone with Victoria's intelligence and determination. But Victoria's casual dismissal of my professional background was about to prove the most costly mistake of her criminal career. Because the woman she had chosen to murder with plant-based toxins was actually Dr. Margaret Chen, Professor Emerita of Analytical Chemistry at the University of Washington, former director of the Pacific Northwest Poison Control Research Laboratory, and internationally recognized expert in forensic toxicology who had spent the last 15 years of her career helping law enforcement agencies solve poisoning cases across the western United States. My specialty, the area of research that had defined my academic career and earned me recognition from colleagues around the world, was the identification and analysis of plant-based toxins used in criminal poisonings. I had published over 60 peer-reviewed articles on the subject, testified as an expert witness in dozens of criminal trials, and trained hundreds of law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and forensic scientists in the detection and analysis of botanical poisons. The irony of Victoria's choice of murder weapon was so perfect that it would have been comedic if it weren't so deadly serious. She had chosen to poison someone who had literally written the textbook on plant-based toxins used in homicide cases. The mixture she had prepared for me, oleander extract combined with digitalis and several other cardiac glycosides, was a combination I had analyzed in at least a dozen criminal investigations over the past 2 decades. But Victoria's ignorance about my professional background was just the beginning of the miscalculations that had doomed her murder attempt from the moment she conceived it. Because while she had been spending 3 years manipulating David and planning my elimination, I had been conducting my own investigation into her past, her methods, and her ultimate intentions. My investigation had begun innocently enough, shortly after David announced his engagement to Victoria. As a mother who loved her son, I had wanted to learn more about the woman he planned to marry. But as someone who had spent 40 years analyzing evidence and identifying patterns, I had quickly noticed inconsistencies in Victoria's story that demanded further investigation. Victoria claimed to be a successful marketing consultant who had met David at a charity fundraiser. But when I discreetly researched her professional background, I discovered that her consulting business had no web presence, no client testimonials, and no evidence of actual work beyond a basic business registration with the state of Washington. Victoria claimed to be a widow, grieving the loss of her first husband in a tragic climbing accident. But when I accessed public records about Michael Pemberton's death, I found discrepancies in Victoria's timeline and details that suggested she had been far more prepared for his death than a loving wife should have been. Most troubling, Victoria claimed to come from a close-knit family with strong values and traditional morals. But my research revealed that she had been estranged from her parents for over a decade, had no contact with her siblings, and had left a trail of broken relationships and financial disputes throughout her adult life. These discoveries had prompted me to dig deeper into Victoria's background, using resources and techniques I had developed during my years of forensic consulting work. What I found was a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back over 15 years. and included at least 3 previous relationships where Victoria had systematically isolated men from their families and support systems before gaining control over their finances and assets. The most chilling discovery was information about Victoria's relationship with her previous husband, Michael Pemberton. According to medical records I was able to access through professional contacts, Michael had experienced a series of unexplained health issues during the final year of their marriage, symptoms that were consistent with chronic low-level poisoning by plant-based toxins. Michael's death certificate listed the cause of death as, quote, cardiac arrest due to exertion at high altitude, but the medical examiner's notes mentioned unusual cardiac irregularities that had contributed to his inability to survive what should have been a survivable climbing accident. No toxicology testing had been performed because the death appeared to be clearly accidental, but the symptoms Michael had experienced before his death were remarkably similar to those caused by chronic oleander exposure. I had also discovered that Victoria had researched plant-based poisons extensively in the months before Michael's death, using the computer at her local library to access articles about digitalis poisoning, oleander toxicity, and methods of extracting cardiac glycosides from common garden plants. The librarian who assisted with these research sessions remembered Victoria specifically because she had asked detailed questions about the medicinal and toxic properties of various plants. Armed with this information, I had realized that Victoria represented a far greater threat to David than simple emotional manipulation or financial exploitation. She was a serial predator who used plant-based poisons to eliminate obstacles to her plans, and she had almost certainly murdered her previous husband using techniques she was now planning to use against me. This discovery had prompted me to begin preparing for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. Victoria would eventually realize that I posed a threat to her control over David, and when that moment came, she would attempt to eliminate me using the same method she had used against Michael. But unlike Michael, I was not an unsuspecting victim who would consume poison without recognizing what was happening. I was a forensic toxicologist who could identify plant-based poisons by their smell, their appearance, and their effects. More importantly, I was someone who had been expecting Victoria's attack and had prepared countermeasures that would turn her own weapons against her. My preparation had begun 6 months earlier, when I noticed that Victoria's manipulation of David was reaching a critical phase. She had successfully isolated him from most of his friends and family members, had gained significant control over his business and financial affairs, and was beginning to make comments about my declining health and increasing confusion that suggested she was laying the groundwork for claims about my mental incompetence. I had recognized these as classic patterns that preceded more direct action against elderly family members who posed obstacles to inheritance or control schemes. Victoria was preparing to make her final move, and I needed to be ready to document and counter whatever attack she chose to make. My first step had been to establish comprehensive documentation of my own mental and physical health, working with independent medical professionals to create records that would refute any claims Victoria might make about my competence or capacity. I underwent neuropsychological testing, comprehensive physical examinations, and cognitive assessments that established my complete mental acuity and physical health. These medical records were crucial because they would prevent Victoria from successfully claiming that I was confused, paranoid, or mentally incompetent if I accused her of attempted murder. Any defense attorney who tried to suggest that I had imagined or fabricated evidence of poisoning would be confronted with extensive medical documentation proving my complete mental clarity and reliability. I had also begun documenting Victoria's behavior patterns and manipulation techniques, creating a detailed record of her systematic campaign to isolate David from his family and support systems. This documentation included photographs of family gatherings that Victoria had disrupted, recordings of phone conversations where she made disparaging comments about me, and copies of emails and text messages that revealed her strategies for controlling David's schedule and relationships. Most importantly, I had begun working with Dr. James Patterson, a colleague from my forensic toxicology days who now ran a private analytical laboratory specializing in poison detection and analysis. Dr. Patterson had helped me establish monitoring systems that would allow me to quickly identify and analyze any toxic substances that Victoria might attempt to use against me. When Victoria called that Tuesday morning to suggest our reconciliation tea, I had immediately contacted Dr. Patterson to put our detection systems on standby. I knew that Victoria's sudden interest in family harmony meant she was preparing to make her final move, and I wanted to be ready to capture and analyze whatever poison she brought to our meeting. The analytical equipment Dr. Patterson had provided was concealed throughout my apartment in ways that would be invisible to a casual observer, but would allow me to collect samples and evidence of any toxic substances Victoria might introduce. I had portable mass spectrometry equipment hidden in my kitchen cabinets, digital pH meters disguised as decorative objects, and sampling containers that would allow me to preserve evidence for later analysis. But my most important preparation was psychological rather than technical. I had spent months studying Victoria's manipulation techniques, learning to recognize her tells and patterns, and preparing myself to respond to her strategies without revealing my own knowledge and intentions. Victoria was skilled at reading people and adapting her approach based on their reactions and responses. If I had shown any sign of suspicion or awareness during her visit, she might have abandoned her plan and chosen a different method of attack. Instead, I needed to appear exactly as she expected. A naive elderly woman who was grateful for attention from her son's wife and completely unprepared for the betrayal that was coming. This performance had required every bit of acting skill I could muster, because watching Victoria prepare poison for me while maintaining a facade of family reconciliation was one of the most chilling experiences of my life. But I had forced myself to stay in character, responding to her manipulation attempts with the kind of emotional vulnerability and gratitude that would encourage her to proceed with her plan. The cup-switching strategy I had employed was something I had been planning for weeks, practicing the movements until I could execute them smoothly and naturally without drawing attention to what I was doing. I had studied Victoria's behavioral patterns during previous visits, noting that she tended to focus intensely on her own performance, rather than paying careful attention to environmental details that didn't directly support her objectives. When Victoria had returned to the kitchen to get the teapot, her attention had been completely focused on maintaining her role as the caring daughter-in-law seeking reconciliation. She had been so invested in her performance that she failed to notice the subtle rearrangement of our tea service that would ultimately save my life and destroy hers. But the cup switch was only the beginning of my counter-strategy. While Victoria was unknowingly poisoning herself with her own toxic tea blend, I was collecting evidence that would prove her attempted murder and ensure that she faced the full consequences of her crimes. The digital recording equipment I had concealed throughout my apartment was capturing every word of our conversation, including Victoria's detailed explanations of her grandmother's healing tea, and her specific instructions about preparation methods that revealed her knowledge of toxic plant extraction techniques. The video cameras I had positioned around my kitchen were documenting Victoria's tea preparation process, showing exactly how she measured and mixed the ingredients she had brought with her. This footage would provide irrefutable evidence that Victoria had deliberately prepared a toxic mixture and had intended for me to consume it. Most importantly, I was collecting samples of Victoria's tea blend for analysis by Dr. Patterson's laboratory. While Victoria focused on her performance of reconciliation, I had used small syringes concealed beneath the table to collect portions of the tea mixture for chemical analysis. These samples would provide definitive proof of exactly what toxins Victoria had used and in what concentrations. The analytical results I would receive from Dr. Patterson's laboratory would be devastating to any defense Victoria might attempt to mount. The tea mixture she had prepared contained oleander extract, digitalis, and several other cardiac glycosides in concentrations that would have been lethal to someone of my age and body weight. There was no possible explanation for these compounds being present in a legitimate herbal tea blend. Their presence could only be explained by deliberate criminal intent. But perhaps the most damning evidence I was collecting was Victoria's own behavior and statements during our meeting. As the poison she had intended for me began to affect her own system, Victoria's careful facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of the calculating predator beneath her performance of family reconciliation. When Victoria realized that something was wrong with the tea, her first concern had not been for my safety or welfare, it had been for the success of her plan. When she suspected that the cups had been switched, her reaction had been anger and panic rather than confusion or concern. These responses revealed someone who knew exactly what toxic substances were in the tea, and who had expected them to affect me rather than her. Most tellingly, when I suggested that Victoria seek medical help for her deteriorating condition, she had refused to explain what was in the tea blend because doing so would require her to confess to attempted murder. This response proved that Victoria knew the tea contained lethal toxins and that she had prepared it with criminal intent. All of this evidence, the recordings, the video footage, the chemical analysis, and Victoria's own statements and behavior, would combine to create an overwhelming case for attempted murder that no defense attorney could successfully challenge. But Victoria still didn't understand the full scope of what she was facing. She thought she was dealing with a lucky elderly woman who had somehow stumbled onto her plan and managed to turn it against her. She had no idea that she had attempted to murder one of the most qualified forensic toxicologists in the country, someone who had spent decades helping law enforcement agencies solve exactly the kind of crime Victoria had just attempted. The expertise that Victoria had dismissed as irrelevant, my background in analytical chemistry and forensic toxicology, was actually the perfect preparation for recognizing, documenting, and prosecuting her murder attempt. Every technique she had used, every compound she had chosen, every method she had employed, was something I had encountered multiple times in my professional career. More importantly, Victoria had no idea that I had been investigating her background for months and had uncovered evidence of her previous crimes, including the probable murder of her first husband. The attempted poisoning she had just committed wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of predatory behavior that would make her prosecution far more serious and her potential sentence far more severe. When the paramedics arrived to treat Victoria's poisoning symptoms, they would find a woman who had been caught in the act of attempted murder by someone with the knowledge, resources, and evidence to ensure that she spent the rest of her life in prison. Victoria had chosen to target the one person in Seattle who was perfectly equipped to recognize her methods, counter her strategies, and ensure that justice was served for her crimes. And she was about to discover that underestimating a forensic toxicologist had been the last mistake she would ever make as a free woman. The breaking point came 3 days after Victoria's arrest, when my son David finally arrived at my apartment with the haunted expression of a man whose entire understanding of reality had been shattered beyond repair. For 72 hours, he had been in complete denial about the charges against his wife, convinced that there had been some terrible mistake or misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right lawyer and the proper explanations. But when Detective Morrison had finally shown him the evidence, the journal entries documenting Victoria's plans to murder me, the toxicology reports proving the tea had been laced with lethal poisons, and the video footage of Victoria preparing the deadly mixture in my kitchen, David had been forced to confront the devastating truth about the woman he had loved and trusted for 3 years. When I opened my door that Thursday evening and saw my son standing in the hallway with tears streaming down his face, I knew that Victoria's carefully constructed web of manipulation and deceit had finally collapsed completely. David wasn't just crying because his wife had been arrested for attempted murder. He was crying because he was finally beginning to understand the scope of the psychological manipulation he had endured and the extent to which Victoria had systematically destroyed every meaningful relationship in his life. "Mom," David said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry for everything I let happen to us." I pulled my son into my arms for the first time in over a year, feeling his body shake with the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from someone who has just realized they have been living a lie for years. David had spent 3 years believing that I was the source of tension in his marriage, that my inability to let go and accept his adult independence was creating problems between him and Victoria. Now he was beginning to understand that Victoria had orchestrated every conflict, manufactured every crisis, and manipulated his perceptions so thoroughly that he had been unable to recognize reality, even when it was happening directly in front of him. "David," I said softly, holding him as he cried, "you don't need to apologize to me. Victoria is a master manipulator who spent years studying exactly how to control your thoughts and emotions. What happened to our relationship wasn't your fault. It was the result of sophisticated psychological abuse that would have fooled anyone." But David's guilt and self-recrimination went far deeper than simple regret about our damaged relationship. As Detective Morrison had walked him through the evidence of Victoria's crimes, David had begun to realize that he had been unknowingly complicit in his wife's criminal behavior, providing her with information, resources, and cover that had enabled her to plan and attempt murder. "She used me," David said through his tears. "Everything I told her about you, about your routines, about your health, about our family history, she used all of it to plan how to kill you. I gave her the information she needed to commit murder, and I had no idea what she was doing." This realization was perhaps the most devastating aspect of David's awakening to Victoria's true nature. He was beginning to understand that his wife hadn't just manipulated him emotionally. She had turned him into an unwitting accomplice in attempted murder by extracting information from him that she had used to plan my death. Victoria had pumped David for details about my daily routines, my health conditions, my social habits, and my relationship patterns. She had asked seemingly innocent questions about what kinds of tea I preferred, whether I had any heart problems, how often I received visitors, and what my typical evening schedule looked like. David had answered these questions thinking he was helping his wife understand his family better, never realizing that he was providing reconnaissance information for a murder plot. She knew exactly when to call me, exactly what to say to get me to agree to the tea visit, exactly how to approach me in a way that wouldn't raise suspicions, I explained to David. She had all that knowledge because you had innocently provided her with detailed information about my personality, my habits, and my vulnerabilities. David's reaction to this revelation was a mixture of horror, guilt, and rage that was difficult to watch. He was furious with Victoria for manipulating him, but he was also furious with himself for being so thoroughly deceived. Most painfully, he was struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he had married with the cold-blooded predator who had been systematically planning his mother's murder. "How could I have been so blind?" David asked, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "There must have been signs, warning signals, something that should have told me what kind of person she really was." This question opened up the most difficult conversation David and I had ever had, because the answer was that there had indeed been warning signs, dozens of them, but Victoria had been so skilled at gaslighting and manipulation that David had been unable to trust his own perceptions and instincts. Over the next several hours, as David and I talked through the past 3 years of his marriage, we began to identify the many moments when his intuition had told him that something was wrong with Victoria's behavior, only to have those concerns dismissed or explained away by Victoria's sophisticated manipulation techniques. David remembered feeling uncomfortable about Victoria's insistence on managing all their social plans and financial decisions. He had occasionally wondered why Victoria seemed to have no close friends from her past, and why she was estranged from her entire family. He had noticed that Victoria became angry or upset whenever he spent time with me or with his longtime friends, even though she claimed to support those relationships. Most tellingly, David remembered several occasions when Victoria had made comments about other people that seemed unusually cold or calculating, revealing a capacity for callousness that had made him briefly question her character and values. "There was this time," David said, "when we heard that one of her former neighbors had died in an accident. Instead of expressing sadness or sympathy, Victoria's first comment was about how much the man's house would probably sell for and who would inherit his property. I remember thinking it was a strange reaction, but when I mentioned it, she said I was being overly sensitive and that practical concerns were a normal part of dealing with death." Victoria had systematically trained David not to trust his own judgment about her behavior, convincing him that his concerns and observations were evidence of his own psychological problems rather than legitimate warnings about her character. Whenever David questioned something Victoria did or said, she would respond with elaborate explanations that made him feel foolish for having doubts, or she would suggest that his concerns revealed his own insecurity, jealousy, or inability to trust in a healthy relationship. "She made me feel like my instincts were always wrong," David said. "Whenever something felt off to me, Victoria would have a perfectly reasonable explanation that made me feel stupid for being suspicious. Over time, I stopped trusting my own perceptions and started relying on her interpretation of everything that happened around us." This was the essence of Victoria's psychological manipulation strategy. She had systematically undermined David's confidence in his own judgment while positioning herself as the reliable source of truth and wisdom in their relationship. She had created a dynamic where questioning her meant questioning reality itself, making it psychologically safer for David to ignore his instincts than to confront the possibility that his wife was not who she claimed to be. The conversation David and I had that evening was both heartbreaking and healing, as we worked together to reconstruct the timeline of Victoria's manipulation and identify the specific techniques she had used to control his thoughts and emotions. It was like performing psychological archaeology, carefully excavating the layers of deception and gaslighting that Victoria had built up over 3 years of marriage. But the most difficult moment came when David asked me directly about the evidence Detective Morrison had shown him regarding Victoria's previous marriages and the suspicious deaths of the men she had been involved with. "Mom," David said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Detective Morrison told me that Victoria probably murdered her first husband, and that there might be other men who died because of her. Is that really true?" I had been dreading this question because I knew that learning about Victoria's history as a serial killer would be even more devastating for David than discovering that she had tried to murder me. David was going to have to live with the knowledge that he had been married to someone who had committed multiple murders, and that he had been completely unaware of the monster sleeping beside him for 3 years. "Yes, David," I said gently. "The evidence strongly suggests that Victoria has been using plant-based poisons to murder people for over 15 years. She's not just someone who tried to kill me in a moment of desperation. She's a serial predator who has been systematically eliminating obstacles to her plans for most of her adult life." David's reaction to this information was immediate and visceral. He ran to my bathroom and was physically sick, his body rejecting the reality of what he was learning about his wife. When he emerged several minutes later, his face was pale and drawn, and he looked like he had aged years in the space of a single conversation. "How many people?" David asked. "How many people do you think she killed?" "We don't know for certain yet," I replied. "But based on the evidence I've uncovered, there are at least 4 suspicious deaths that appear to be connected to Victoria, and there may be more as the investigation continues." David sank into my sofa with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had been destroyed. "I was married to a serial killer," he said, more to himself than to me. "I shared a bed with someone who was murdering people, and I had no idea." But even more disturbing for David was the realization that Victoria had almost certainly been planning to murder him as well, once she had eliminated all the other obstacles to her complete control over his assets and life. The journal entries Detective Morrison had found included references to David's eventual transition and Victoria's plans for long-term financial management that strongly suggested she viewed David as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent partner. "She was going to kill me too, wasn't she?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I believe so," I said. "The evidence suggests that Victoria viewed everyone in her life as either useful tools or obstacles to be eliminated. Once she had gained complete control over your business and eliminated all your family and friends, you would have become a liability rather than an asset." This realization was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of David's awakening to Victoria's true nature. He was beginning to understand that his wife had never loved him. She had been systematically preparing to murder him, just as she had murdered Michael Pemberton and the other men who had served her purposes before becoming inconvenient. "The whole marriage was just an elaborate setup for murder," David said, his voice hollow with shock. "She never cared about me at all. I was just another victim she was preparing to eliminate when the time was right." As we continued talking through the night, David began to piece together additional evidence of Victoria's criminal planning that he had witnessed but hadn't understood at the time. He remembered Victoria asking detailed questions about his will and life insurance policies, claiming she wanted to make sure their estate planning was properly organized. He remembered her insistence on being added to all his business accounts and her gradual assumption of control over his firm's financial management. Most chillingly, David remembered several occasions when Victoria had suggested changes to his diet and exercise routine, claiming she was concerned about his health and wanted to help him live a longer, healthier life. Now he realized that Victoria had probably been experimenting with low-level poisoning, studying how his body reacted to various substances as preparation for eventually administering a lethal dose. "She was practicing on me," David said with horrified understanding. All those times she made special meals or smoothies for my health, all those herbal supplements she wanted me to try. She was testing different poisons to see how they affected me. This pattern was consistent with what we had discovered about Victoria's treatment of Michael Pemberton before his death. She had spent months administering sublethal doses of cardiac toxins, studying their effects and building tolerance patterns before finally administering the fatal dose that had caused his climbing accident death. Victoria's method was to slowly condition her victims' bodies to tolerate increasing levels of poison, making the eventual lethal dose less likely to be detected by medical examiners, who might notice if someone with no previous exposure suddenly died of plant toxin poisoning. But perhaps the most devastating realization for David was understanding how completely Victoria had isolated him from everyone who might have been able to help him recognize what was happening. She had systematically eliminated his relationships with family members, longtime friends, business associates, and anyone else who might have questioned her behavior or provided David with alternative perspectives on their marriage. She made sure I had no one, David said. No one who could warn me. No one who could help me see what she was doing. No one who would investigate if something happened to me. She had me completely alone and vulnerable. This isolation strategy was crucial to Victoria's success as a serial predator. By eliminating David's support network, she had ensured that there would be no one to question the circumstances if he died unexpectedly, and no one to provide emotional or practical support that might help him recognize the signs of abuse and manipulation. Victoria had also been careful to maintain David's professional reputation and social standing while destroying his personal relationships. She wanted him to appear successful and stable to the outside world, making it less likely that anyone would suspect foul play if he died suddenly. As dawn approached and our conversation continued, David began to express concerns about the other people in his life who might still be in danger from Victoria. Even though she was in custody awaiting trial, David worried that Victoria might have accomplices or backup plans that could threaten the safety of anyone who might testify against her or support the prosecution's case. What if she has other people working with her? David asked. What if there are other victims we don't know about? What if she tries to have someone hurt you or me to prevent us from testifying? These were legitimate concerns that Detective Morrison and I had already discussed. Serial predators like Victoria often had associates, romantic partners, or other criminals who helped facilitate their activities in exchange for financial benefits or other considerations. But our investigation had found no evidence that Victoria had worked with accomplices in her criminal activities. Her method of operation was too personal and too dependent on intimate manipulation to require assistance from others. Victoria succeeded by making her victims trust her completely, and that level of trust would be difficult to maintain if other people were involved in her schemes. However, Detective Morrison had arranged for increased security monitoring for both David and me during the period leading up to Victoria's trial. We were both provided with emergency contact procedures and safety protocols that would help protect us if Victoria somehow managed to threaten us from custody. As our conversation finally wound down in the early hours of Friday morning, David made a decision that I knew was crucial to his psychological recovery and to the success of the prosecution's case against Victoria. I want to help, David said. I want to do everything I can to make sure Victoria is convicted and sentenced for what she's done. I want to testify against her. I want to provide evidence. I want to help the other victims' families find justice for what she did to their loved ones. This decision represented a complete break from the psychological control Victoria had exercised over David for 3 years. He was choosing to trust his own judgment, to believe in the evidence of Victoria's crimes, and to take action against someone who had systematically abused and manipulated him. David's cooperation would be invaluable to the prosecution's case because he could provide insider information about Victoria's behavior, her statements, her activities, and her psychological manipulation techniques that no outside investigator could have accessed. More importantly, David's testimony would help establish the pattern of predatory behavior that made Victoria such a dangerous criminal. His first-hand account of her manipulation methods would help the jury understand how she had been able to control and deceive multiple victims over many years. David, I said as we finally prepared to get some rest, I'm proud of you for choosing to face the truth about Victoria, even though it's painful. It takes tremendous courage to admit that you've been deceived by someone you loved, and even more courage to take action against them. David's transformation from Victoria's victim to her prosecutor would be crucial not just for ensuring justice in our case, but for protecting other potential victims from the kind of sophisticated, predatory behavior that Victoria had perfected over her criminal career. The breaking point had been reached, and Victoria's carefully constructed world of manipulation and control had finally collapsed completely. But her arrest and prosecution were just the beginning of the consequences she would face for choosing to target a family that had the knowledge, resources, and determination to ensure that justice was served for all her victims. 8 months after Victoria Pemberton Chen tried to poison me with her grandmother's special tea, I sat in the front row of King County Superior Court, watching a jury deliver guilty verdicts on all 17 counts of murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse that the prosecution had brought against the woman who had systematically destroyed lives for over 15 years. As the foreman read each verdict, guilty, 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 I felt a profound sense of closure not just for myself, but for all the victims whose deaths had finally been acknowledged and whose families could finally find peace in knowing that justice had been served. The trial had been a masterpiece of forensic evidence and prosecutorial strategy, built on the foundation of documentation and analysis that I had spent months carefully constructing. Every piece of evidence I had collected during Victoria's attempted murder, the audio recordings, the video footage, the chemical analysis, the toxicology reports, had been presented with devastating effectiveness to a jury that had no choice but to conclude that Victoria was exactly what the evidence proved her to be: a calculating serial killer who used sophisticated knowledge of plant-based poisons to eliminate obstacles to her financial advancement. But the evidence that sealed Victoria's fate wasn't just related to her attempt on my life. During the 8 months between her arrest and trial, investigators had uncovered a web of criminal activity that spanned 3 states and 15 years, revealing Victoria as one of the most prolific and dangerous serial predators law enforcement had ever encountered. The breakthrough that transformed Victoria's case from attempted murder to multiple homicide came when forensic investigators exhumed the body of Michael Pemberton, Victoria's first husband, and conducted the toxicology testing that should have been performed at the time of his death. The results were unequivocal. Michael's tissues contained high concentrations of oleander alkaloids and digitalis compounds that could only have been administered through systematic poisoning over a period of several months. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, prosecutor Amanda Richardson had said during her closing argument, the defendant didn't just try to murder Dr. Margaret Chen with plant-based poisons. She perfected those techniques by murdering her first husband, Michael Pemberton, using identical methods. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was the calculated action of a serial killer who had been refining her methods for over a decade. The prosecution's case had been devastating in its comprehensiveness and precision. They presented evidence showing that Victoria had murdered Michael Pemberton in 2019, Robert Martinez in 2014, Dr. Thomas Wheeler in 2017, and Jonathan Hayes in 2020, before attempting to murder me in 2023. Each murder had been carried out using plant-based toxins that Victoria had researched extensively, and each victim had been someone who either possessed information that threatened Victoria's carefully constructed identity or represented an obstacle to her financial advancement. The pattern was so clear and consistent that it was impossible for any reasonable person to dismiss it as coincidence. Victoria had identified victims based on their vulnerability and their value to her plans, had studied their habits and weaknesses until she could approach them without suspicion, had administered carefully calculated doses of plant-based poisons that would cause death while appearing to be natural medical events, and had then inherited their assets or eliminated the threats they represented to her other criminal activities. But what made the prosecution's case truly unassailable was the quality and quantity of evidence I had provided about Victoria's attempted murder of me. Unlike her previous victims who had died without anyone suspecting foul play, Victoria had tried to poison someone who was perfectly equipped to recognize, document, and analyze her methods. The audio recording of our tea conversation had been played for the jury multiple times, allowing them to hear Victoria's own voice as she described her, special blend, and explained the preparation techniques that revealed her sophisticated knowledge of toxic plant extraction. The video footage of Victoria preparing the poison tea in my kitchen provided visual evidence of her deliberate and methodical approach to attempted murder. Most damning was the chemical analysis of the tea mixture Victoria had prepared for me. Dr. James Patterson, my forensic laboratory colleague, had testified about the precise concentrations of oleander extract, digitalis, and other cardiac glycosides that Victoria had included in her blend, explaining to the jury that these compounds could only have been present as the result of deliberate criminal intent. Dr. Patterson, Prosecutor Richardson, had asked during his testimony, "In your expert opinion, what would have happened if Dr. Chen had consumed the full cup of tea that the defendant prepared for her?" "Dr. Chen would have died within 2 to 4 hours, Dr. Patterson had replied. The concentration of cardiac glycosides in that tea mixture was more than sufficient to cause rapid heart failure in someone of her age and body weight. This was not a preparation designed to cause illness or discomfort. This was a lethal weapon disguised as herbal tea." The jury had been visibly shaken by this testimony, and several jurors had looked directly at Victoria with expressions of disgust and horror. The evidence was so clear and the intent so obvious that there was no possibility of claiming the poisoning had been accidental or unintentional. Victoria's defense team had attempted several different strategies to challenge the prosecution's case, but each approach had been systematically dismantled by the weight of evidence and the quality of expert testimony that supported the charges against her. Initially, Victoria's lawyers had tried to argue that the deaths of her previous victims had been coincidental, and that the attempted poisoning of me had been the result of a tragic misunderstanding about the contents of her grandmother's tea blend. But this defense collapsed when investigators discovered Victoria's personal research library, which included detailed notes about plant-based toxins, extraction techniques, and the physiological effects of various cardiac glycosides. Victoria's own handwriting provided evidence that she had been studying poisonous plants for years, learning how to identify them, cultivate them, and process them into concentrated toxins that could be administered without detection. Her notes included specific information about dosage calculations, delivery methods, and techniques for masking the bitter taste of plant-based poisons, knowledge that could only have been acquired through extensive research and experimentation. When the handwriting defense failed, Victoria's attorneys tried to challenge my credibility as a witness, suggesting that my age and stress about family conflicts had caused me to misinterpret innocent behavior as evidence of criminal intent. But this approach backfired spectacularly when the prosecution presented my professional credentials and the extensive medical documentation proving my complete mental acuity and professional competence. Dr. Sarah Walsh, the neuropsychologist who had evaluated my cognitive function, testified that my mental capabilities were exceptional for someone of any age, and that I showed no signs of confusion, paranoia, or impaired judgment that might affect the reliability of my observations and conclusions. More importantly, the defense's attempt to portray me as a confused elderly woman was completely contradicted by the sophisticated evidence collection and analysis I had conducted during Victoria's attempted murder. The audio recordings, video documentation, chemical analysis, and forensic investigation I had orchestrated demonstrated a level of professional competence that made any claims about my mental reliability appear ridiculous. Victoria's defense team then attempted to argue that even if the poisoning had been intentional, it represented an isolated incident of poor judgment, rather than evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior. But this defense was destroyed when investigators presented evidence from Victoria's journal, which documented her criminal planning and revealed her calculated approach to eliminating obstacles to her plans. The journal entries were read aloud in court, allowing the jury to hear Victoria's own thoughts about her victims and her systematic approach to murder. Michael's climbing accident provided the perfect cover, one entry read. High-altitude cardiac events are common enough that no one questioned the underlying cause. Future eliminations should follow similar patterns of apparent natural causation. Another entry, dated just weeks before her attempt on my life, was even more explicit. Traditional manipulation techniques have reached their limits with the Chen situation. Direct action will be necessary to achieve permanent resolution of this obstacle. These journal entries provided irrefutable evidence that Victoria had been planning and executing murders for years, and that her attempt on my life was part of a well-established pattern of criminal behavior rather than an isolated incident. The final defense strategy was perhaps the most desperate. Victoria's attorneys tried to argue that she had been acting in self-defense, claiming that I had somehow threatened her or created a situation where she felt her life was in danger. But this argument was immediately dismissed when the prosecution presented evidence showing that Victoria had been planning my murder for months, long before any supposed threat from me could have materialized. The evidence of Victoria's long-term planning included her research into my daily routines, her questions to David about my health and habits, her acquisition of the toxic plants needed to prepare the poison, and her careful selection of a tea preparation method that would allow her to administer lethal toxins while maintaining the appearance of a friendly family visit. Ladies and gentlemen, Prosecutor Richardson had said during her closing argument, the defendant spent months planning Dr. Chen's murder with the same methodical precision she had used to kill 4 other people over the past 15 years. This was not self-defense. This was premeditated murder by someone who had turned killing into a refined criminal skill. When all of Victoria's defense strategies had been exhausted and the evidence had been fully presented, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. The speed of their deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of Victoria's criminal intent. Judge Patricia Williams, who had presided over the trial with patience and fairness, delivered Victoria's sentence with a tone of grave finality that reflected the seriousness of her crimes. Victoria Pemberton Chen, you have been found guilty of 4 counts of murder in the first degree, 1 count of attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, fraud, and multiple related felonies. The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years on the remaining charges. Victoria's reaction to this sentence was the first genuine emotion she had shown throughout the entire trial. For months, she had maintained a facade of dignified innocence, sitting quietly at the defense table and occasionally dabbing at her eyes with tissues, as if she were the victim of a terrible miscarriage of justice. But when Judge Williams pronounced the life sentence, Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. She screamed that the trial had been unfair, that I had somehow framed her, and that everyone involved in her prosecution would eventually face consequences for their actions against her. "You have no idea what you've done," Victoria shouted as bailiffs moved to restrain her. "Margaret Chen destroyed my life with her lies and manipulation, and now you're all helping her get away with it." Even in her final moments as a free woman, Victoria was still attempting to manipulate reality, still trying to position herself as the victim rather than accepting responsibility for the lives she had destroyed through her predatory behavior. As Victoria was led away in shackles to begin serving a sentence that would keep her imprisoned for the rest of her life, I felt a profound sense of relief that justice had finally been served not just for me, but for Michael Pemberton, Robert Martinez, Dr. Thomas Wheeler, Jonathan Hayes, and any other victims whose deaths we might never discover. The impact of Victoria's conviction extended far beyond the specific crimes she had been charged with. Her case became a landmark prosecution that changed how law enforcement agencies investigated suspicious deaths involving plant-based toxins, and her methods were studied by forensic toxicologists around the world as an example of how sophisticated knowledge could be used for criminal purposes. More importantly, Victoria's prosecution led to the reopening of dozens of similar cases where unexplained deaths might have been the result of plant-based poisoning. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing suspicious deaths with new awareness of the techniques Victoria had used, and several additional murder cases were solved as a result of the investigative methods developed during our case. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Victoria's trial was the healing it provided for the families of her victims. Michael Pemberton's parents, who had spent years struggling to understand why their healthy son had died suddenly during a routine climbing expedition, finally had answers about what had really happened to him. "We always knew something was wrong," Michael's mother, Dorothy Pemberton, said after the trial concluded. "Michael was an experienced climber in excellent health. His death never made sense to us, but no one would listen when we tried to ask questions about the circumstances." The families of Victoria's other victims expressed similar relief at finally understanding the truth about their loved ones' deaths and knowing that the person responsible would never be able to hurt anyone else. For David, Victoria's conviction marked the end of a long and painful process of recovery from the psychological manipulation and abuse he had endured during their marriage. With the help of Dr. Lisa Rahman, the forensic psychologist who had analyzed Victoria's manipulation techniques, David had been able to understand how he had been systematically deceived and to rebuild his ability to trust his own judgment and perceptions. Dr. Rahman helped me understand that what happened to me wasn't a failure of intelligence or character, David told me months after the trial. Victoria was a master manipulator who had been perfecting her techniques for years. Anyone could have been deceived by someone with her skills and determination. David's recovery had been aided by his decision to cooperate fully with the prosecution and to testify about Victoria's manipulation techniques and criminal planning. By taking an active role in ensuring that Victoria faced justice, David had been able to reclaim his sense of agency and control over his own life. Today, 2 years after Victoria's conviction, David has rebuilt his architectural practice, restored his relationships with friends and colleagues who had been driven away by Victoria's manipulation, and even begun dating someone new, a fellow architect named Sarah, who appreciates his kindness and integrity without trying to control or manipulate him. As for me, Victoria's failed murder attempt and subsequent conviction have given me a renewed sense of purpose and satisfaction in my later years. At 72, I have become something of an expert consultant on cases involving plant-based poisoning, working with law enforcement agencies around the country to help solve similar crimes and prevent future victims. The educational foundation I established with the proceeds from publishing my account of Victoria's crimes has provided scholarships to dozens of students pursuing careers in forensic science, toxicology, and criminal justice. These young people are being trained to recognize and counter the kinds of sophisticated criminal techniques that predators like Victoria use to exploit and harm innocent victims. I also regularly speak at conferences and training seminars for law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and social workers about the warning signs of systematic manipulation and abuse that preceded Victoria's attempted murder. The goal is to help people recognize these patterns before they escalate to violence, potentially saving lives and protecting families from the kind of destruction Victoria caused. Most importantly, I have learned that the qualities that made me a successful analytical chemist, attention to detail, systematic thinking, careful documentation, and refusal to accept convenient explanations when evidence suggests otherwise, are exactly the qualities needed to counter sophisticated criminal behavior. Victoria thought she could eliminate me because she saw me as a weak, isolated elderly woman who would be easy to deceive and eliminate. She had no idea that she was targeting someone with the knowledge, skills, and determination to turn her own weapons against her and ensure that she faced justice for all her crimes. The irony of Victoria's downfall is perfect. She was destroyed by the very expertise she had dismissed as irrelevant. The woman who tried to poison a forensic toxicologist with plant-based toxins discovered too late that some people are too dangerous to attack, no matter how vulnerable they might appear. Today, Victoria sits in her maximum security prison cell, serving a life sentence that ensures she will never again be able to manipulate, abuse, or murder anyone. She has lost everything she spent years trying to steal: wealth, status, freedom, and the power to control other people's lives. Meanwhile, the families she destroyed have found peace. The victims she murdered have received justice, and future potential victims have been protected from her predatory behavior. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones where justice is served not through revenge or retaliation, but through the careful application of knowledge, patience, and determination to ensure that the truth is revealed and consequences are applied. Victoria learned, far too late, that underestimating someone who has spent decades building expertise and character is the kind of mistake you can only make once. And in the end, the sweet taste of justice was far more satisfying than any cup of tea we could ever have shared.